"Ooh, it's me from the future. I am the ghost of Rhinebeck's yet to come," and let's just say that you probably shouldn't have had that fourth apple cider donut. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Knitting Vicariously podcast. My name is Caroline. I am found more commonly across Instagram and Ravelry as Dunderknit, and this week's episode is a little bit different. If this is your first time joining the podcast, this is a very non-traditional episode of this podcast. Usually I take a format where we go through some actual knitting, some vicarious knitting, potentially with a little bit of question and answer sessions peppered in towards the end, but this week's episode is actually a little bit of a rogue one. So I am filming this ahead of heading over to Rhinebeck in the US this week. And so this is a podcast that is going to be solely question and answer based, and I'm going to use it as an opportunity to try and fill in the gap between heading off and returning back from Rhinebeck with what I am affectionately calling, in my own mind, the motherload. And so if you do want to see a little bit more of the traditional knitting content, if you'd like to know a little bit more about me or the premise of the podcast on the whole, please do go back and check previous versions of the episodes, potentially even, dare I say it, starting back at episode 1, where I give you a little bit more insight into both me personally and the premise of the podcast. But if you are well versed in all of this, you know where I'm coming from, you know where I'm going to, which is impressive because even I haven't the foggiest, please do come on in, settle on down, and welcome for this week's episode in a slightly different guise. You will see that I am still wearing my lovely stalactite sweater. I hope by this point I will have worn it proudly at Rhinebeck, and that any of you, if you did have the chance to see me or say hello whilst we were there, that we greeted each other, that we hugged in a way that was devoid of any questionable analogies or innuendo, as mentioned in previous weeks. And if I didn't succeed with that, yeah, sorry. But as I mentioned last week, what I have done is I've taken some of the questions that you very kindly sent to me over on YouTube, on Instagram, on Ravelry, when I asked if there was anything more that you would like to know about me, about my background, or about the podcast in general. We touched on a couple of those questions last week, the questions that I'd had from a few different people and a few different areas, and so hopefully those gave you a strong starting point. But this week we're going to be moving on to some of the questions that were perhaps a little bit more left field, a little bit more unique, and in some instances just downright random. To those of you persisting and joining us for the first time, a brief word of warning, which is to say that this is a swearing-friendly podcast, and therefore if you are someone for whom cursing or swearing or just general exclamations of extreme dissatisfaction or delight, who knows, I would suggest that this is probably not the podcast for you. I really appreciate you coming and checking it out, but I'm going to be using my natural language, and my natural language involves a few of the swears. And so because we have a few questions to get through, and because I have no additional knitting to show you this week, we're going to dive straight in to question number 1. This question comes from Juniper Grace on Instagram, and she asks about the origin of my name, Dunderknit. And thank you so much for asking this question. Dunderknit is the name that I've always had, really, since I first started knitting and posting on Instagram and on Ravelry. And it kind of comes from a Scottish expression, which is Dunderhead. And to those of you north of the border, and some of you unfortunate souls south of the border who may know or have been called this in the past, a Dunderhead is someone who is, really it's a Scottish term for an idiot. So head is the Scottish term for head, and dunder is kind of up there with kind of blunder or kind of to make mistakes. And so the idea of calling myself Dunderknit back in the early days when I made an awful lot of mistakes, it really did appeal, it seemed to resonate and make an awful lot of sense. And even to this day, I continue to make some absolute fucking howlers. And to evidence that, so I showcased last week on the podcast my finally pommed up cardamom coffee hat by Caitlin Hunter. And I also mentioned that this pom-pom is detachable. Sewing this onto the hat took me 3 goes. The first time I did it, I tried to sew through the clips in here because I hadn't remembered that this section of the pom-pom clipper is detachable. Yeah. Then I finally remembered, stopped being an absolute idiot, detached this section of the pom-pom, and then sewed the popper onto the top of the hat the wrong way round. And so this little indentation here that you can see in the centre, which should of course be inward facing on the basis that the pom-pom popper here is outward facing, thus making them pop. I sewed it so it was pointing up the way up the top of the hat, so when you try and push these together, shockingly doesn't go. That was number 2. And then finally I remembered to stop being a moron and sew it on the right way. So done doing it. Still appropriate. Next up we have Lions Red on Ravelry, who asked how many people in my family have red hair. I mentioned back in episode 1 that I am a natural redhead, albeit having enhanced it slightly in recent years. And it's a really good question. So I am an only child. My mum is also an only child, and we grew up with my grandmother in the house as well. And aside from me, no one had red hair. Now, that being said, my grandfather, so my mum's dad, who sadly passed away before I was born, he had jet black hair but a ginger beard, which my nana used to give him absolute hell for. And he was never allowed to go out unshaven because she thought he looked so ridiculous with this very dark hair and a very distinctly gingery beard. But beyond that, there's no one in my immediate family. My father's side of the family I don't know at all, but to my knowledge there's no one immediately there that has red hair, so I think it might just be me. But I really enjoy it. I mean, I went through, as I mentioned, definitely some taunts and some name calling when I was in my teenage years, but I definitely feel like I've got to a point where I've grown to appreciate it and like it, and it's something that's unique and different. But let's face it, pretty much anyone can be any hair colour that they like these days, so do what you feel. Amy Smith 30 over on Instagram also mentioned, linked to the point around being a redhead, that was I a Doctor Who fan, because between being Scottish and a redhead, I reminded her slightly of Amy Pond, one of the former Doctor's companions. And it's really funny that you should mention that, actually, because while I'm not a massive diehard Doctor Who fan, I do really enjoy it. And Amy and Karen Gillan, who played her, are it's one of my favourite companions that I've seen in recent years. I mean, obviously I think everyone has a special place in their heart for Rose, but Amy Pond was another really, really strong character in that respect. And funnily enough, my ex's little brother used to be absolutely adamant that I reminded him very much of Amy Pond in that respect, which I take as a huge compliment, because Karen Gillan is gorgeous and also a fucking badass. Because I don't know if you've seen her in anything else other than Doctor Who. I know for a fact she plays Nebula in the Guardians of the Galaxy series, but she is pretty bloody cool. So I'm totally happy to take that comparison. That is, I'm not blue, but I'm taking it. Vanilla Latte Knits over on Instagram asked me the entirely appropriate question, considering her username, which was coffee or tea. And my answer is both. I love a coffee. I have a very fancy coffee machine that I bought myself as a present for getting divorced, and it is something that I enjoy on a very regular basis. It makes properly frothy lattes, which is one of my absolute kryptonites. But I do also really like a cup of tea, and I don't really think there are many British people that can say that they just like tea altogether, whether it is your more traditional kind of Earl Greys or English breakfasts, or even your peppermints or some of your more exotically flavoured. I do love a cup of tea, so somewhere between Earl Grey with milk, sorry, don't hate me, or lattes. I do love both, so can't pick and choose between the two, I'm afraid. Heidi Kelly 064 on Instagram asked me what was the first garment that I ever knit and how did it turn out, and it's a really, really good question. Thank you so much for asking. So I had to rack my brains a little bit, because the first garment that I thought I knit wasn't actually the first garment that I knit. I know very early on I did knit the Jalissa pullover by, I think it's Vanessa Smith, I will double check that, and I do have a picture of that here. Obviously my photography is far from exceptional, but I do have a picture of it that I'll pop up on the screen. But that is not actually my first garment. My first completed garment was a raglan wrap that I cannot for the life of me remember the name of, but I will put it here on the screen along with a deeply unflattering picture of me wearing it. This was from, I believe it was a book called Boutique Knits, and it was a sort of wrap cardigan, drop sleeve in, I think it was sort of DK weight yarn with buttons down the side. I do still have it. I think I wore it maybe 5 times, and I really liked the idea of it. It was a great layering piece and long sleeve t-shirts and so on underneath, but then it occurred to me that actually I don't own any long sleeve t-shirts and hate the thought of wearing anything over the top of them. And that's not a reflection on anyone else's style choices. Absolutely, you do what works for you, but there's just, for me, it's something about, if I'm wearing something underneath, it needs to be like a tank, or maybe something with very short sleeves that is not going to kind of rumple and crumple up underneath. There is a fabulous Scottish expression which is to feel bumfled, and that is nowhere near as sexually inappropriate as it sounds. It literally just means when layers kind of creep up underneath each other, and you talk about feeling a bit bumfled up. And I'm conscious that I have said that a few times now down in England, and it always gets a very, very strange reception. But it's really quite innocuous, I promise. And so I can't really be doing with having that feeling of lots of layers kind of up and underneath themselves. So yeah, unfortunately, it was just a very misguided first project. But it was a lovely knit. It was an awful lot of stockinette, so an awful lot of knitting and purling because it was knit flat. But you know, I finished it, I sewed buttons on, I made a fucking ribbon button band. I mean, who am I? But yeah, I did all of that and then just never really wore it. But but yeah, in more recent years, particularly pullovers for me are something that I've seen a lot more success with, so that's no bad thing. And then both Noonka Yarnaholic and Inspired by Fibre over on Instagram asked me what types of projects I tend to knit the most or enjoy knitting the most in terms of garments or hats or accessories or home decor. And funnily enough, between watching versions of the podcast up until now, having had a look through my Instagram feed or any signs that you will see on Ravelry, I am, I would say, first and foremost a garment knitter, with accessories following a very close second. I do go through phases, but certainly all of this year and an awful lot of last year, garments, particularly pullovers, have been my first love. And I do knit some cardigans, I have knitted some cardigans, but I don't really wear them quite so much. For me, pullovers are definitely the more kind of versatile garments that I own. And again, while I love sock knitting, I go through phases with it. I don't think this year I have completed a single pair of socks. And as someone who in previous years, I think at one point I'd knit sort of 15 or 16 pairs one year, yeah, that's quite a departure. And I think I do put that down to being very garment obsessed at the moment. I do also love knitting accessories, so I've knit more than a fair share of hats, of scarves, of shawls, of mitts in particular. I enjoy knitting shawls. I'm not what I would call a big shawl knitter, in that they very much serve a purpose for me, but I do also really enjoy knitting scarves, and in particular there was a scarf that I knit which was Topiary by Michelle Wong, and that is a scarf that I absolutely love and have seriously considered knitting again, even though it was a scarf and therefore an absolute slog to knit. But no, I do really enjoy knitting accessories. Home decor not so much. I'm not sure there's anything that I've actually knit that would be classified as home decor, but I know at one point I had a fleeting desire to want to knit a stag's head to put on the wall. I've got a bit of a thing with stags generally, but I don't think I ever really got round to it. I might have a bit of a nose knit up somewhere, but beyond that, not too much. I do have a couple of blankets that are on the go, but that's more, I would say, as a means of using up scraps and leftover bits of projects than it is actually the desire to have a blanket that I have knitted. But yeah, it's more of a garment thing for me first and foremost, I reckon. Next up, we have a question from Susan of Athens over on Instagram. Hi Susan, hope you're well. Who asks, how dare you? I think that's an awful question to ask a lady. I mean, I'm outraged. I'm outraged. And 40. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I have a considerable number of whips. So what I will say is that I've talked about the fact that I really enjoy supporting makers and dyers and pattern designers. I've talked about the fact that the plans that I make don't always end up being seen through to fruition. And yeah, I guess I've referenced, I have a fairly intensive day job, and so knitting is definitely something where I take a lot of enjoyment. And with that, I think it's key for me, and this is me personally, I appreciate it does not work for everyone. This is something where it is all about enjoyment and not worrying too much or putting pressure on myself unduly. And so I am pretty comfortable with the fact that I have whips that number well into the double digits, and some of those are projects that I think a lot of people would have ripped out. There are certainly some projects that, in all honesty, I'm probably not going to go back to, but the thought that at some point I might, or I might not want to have them off the needles entirely, just means that I'm going to keep them on the needles for a little bit, and I might reuse those needles, I might nab the cable, I might put them onto waste yarn, I might take the needles and the cables out and not put them on waste yarn, living on the edge. But essentially with it, I am not someone who gives herself a particularly hard time over the number of whips that I have. Now I know that not everyone is like this, and even within my own dear knit group, and Wendy, I am looking at you when I say this, I know that having a significant number of whips is not for everyone. I do appreciate that, and therefore the notion that I have as many as 40 on the go at the moment, it is going to cause some of you to have palpitations, if not kittens, and I do apologise for that, but yeah, it's very much, it works for me. I enjoy having things that I can go back to, I enjoy trying out things and seeing how they pan out, and sometimes I have things that just never see the light of day again, and I may choose to go back to them, I may rip them out, I may not, but essentially that we're all just having fun, really. At least I am. Most of the time. A lot of the time. Most of the time. Linked to that, Sarah May Lynch over on Instagram also asked me, how do you decide what to stash? I feel like decide is a strong word here. For the most part, I will say it is a decision. I do choose things, but essentially I choose things that I like, and I mentioned last week when I was asked what sort of things I was going to be on the lookout for at Rhinebeck, it's very much the yarn chooses the knitter in my case, and so I like going and seeing things I like, having a look, and if I see yarn that I think would make an amazing sweater, and assuming of course I can afford to do it, I will usually buy the sweater quantity's worth of yarn and let it tell me later what it wants to be. And similarly with sock yarn, if I see something and it's pretty and I want to knit with it, and I have the means and the luggage space to be able to do so, then that is something that I'll go on to purchase. But essentially it boils down to, do I see it? Do I like it? Do I have the ability to buy it? Do I think I should buy it? Do I really think I should buy it? Do I think I'm going to buy it anyway? Oh no, wait, I've already bought it. Oops. And then a few of you asked, so Isla and Matilda, Inspired by Fibre, Yarn Song and Vix G85 all asked, what is my favourite yarn or desert island yarn? Holy shit. Really? Really? You're going to make me choose one? You're dicks. If I had to pick just one, and frankly, I'm livid at you for making me. I think the yarn that I have the most of in my stash, that I've used the most in projects, and that is probably the most versatile for the sort of things that I knit, given that they are garments, predominantly pullovers, at this point in time, I'm probably going to say Madeline Tosh DK Twist. I have a lot of that base in my stash. DK Twist, it's not quite the same as Tosh DK, which is what's stocked in their retail bases, so it tends to be stocked wholesale worldwide in yarn stores. DK Twist is exclusive to their online retail shop, and given that is US based, yeah, I seem to have made quite a few purchases of it over the years, but I do have an awful lot of it. So a lot of the yarn in these two cubbies is single skeins of DK Twist, and then likewise sweater quantities that are in these three cubbies here. We've got at least 1, 2, 3 in that cubby, 1, 2 in there, and then 2 or so in there. So a good few of the sweater quantities that I have in here are DK Twist, and then, as I say, an awful lot of the single skeins in and around here. That said, I do also love MCN fingering, in particular some of the bases that independent yarn dyers use and hand dyers use for their MCN bases. But if we were really narrowing it down just to one, I think that's probably what I would go with. Now, I do anticipate, I haven't yet cast on with Work Sock, which is also Madeline Tosh and is a yarn that my lovely friend Meredith has been recommending to me for a very, very long time. I think that might end up being my new favourite, but for now, based on what I've used so far, DK Twist is probably going to be the winner. It is a superwash DK weight merino. You get roughly, I think it's 250 yards, which is about 225 metres to a skein. Skeins are usually in excess of around about 100 grams, but the colours are incredibly bright, incredibly saturated, and with a lot of the Madeline Tosh yarns in particular, some of the colourways she dyes are just to die for. Pun sort of intended-ish. But yeah, it's a great base, and although it's superwash, and I appreciate not everyone loves superwash, it is fantastically versatile in that sense. So yeah, that's probably the one that I would choose. And also, if it did have to be a desert island yarn, you know, I feel like superwash yarn would probably cope better with things like seawater and sand. And although, the thought of wet sandy hand knits is making me a little bit, Oy. No thank you please. Yarn Song, who is Rebecca over on Instagram, also asked me if I had a desert yarn pattern or designer, and that's a very difficult question as well. Do I have a pattern? No, not really. In terms of designer, I feel like if I'm going to be on a desert island, ignoring the fact that it might be incredibly warm, if we assume it can be my desert island and therefore I would choose one, you know, in the remote highlands of Scotland where knitting is very much necessary and I have as much stash as I can possibly manage, I think I'd be tempted to go with, I'm going to narrow it down to 3, right? And all of them are going to have something in common, which will become quite apparent in a second. So, Nora Gaughan, Michelle Wong and Thea Coleman. And if you know or are familiar with those designers, you probably see the pattern emerging, no pun intended, because they are incredibly big on cables, on texture, on garments that feature those things very, very heavily, and it's something I absolutely adore. And for all that I love a little bit of lace work, perhaps a little bit of colour work from time to time, I do think that having those kind of gloriously textured and cabled knits, particularly if I were on my own on a desert island, that's probably the thing that would really kind of get my creative juices flowing, so to speak. Kadoodle58, which is frankly an excellent Instagram in the first instance, made I think perhaps even more wonderful by a Scottish accent, because I love the way that we say doodle. But she asked me over on Instagram if I had a recommended project or pattern for learning colourwork. So I think my first colourwork project was a hat, and I think I know which one it was. I believe my first was the Selby Modern hat by Kate Gangan Osborne. I'll pop a picture of my finished project just here. This is a hat pattern that was incredibly popular back when I knit it, and it seems to have gone a little bit quiet in recent years. It might be something to do with the style. It is a sort of slouchy berry style hat, but which is perhaps a little bit more sort of less common than it used to be. But in terms of colourwork, it's a really lovely knit. It was knit, I believe, in felted tweed, which for me I think is either it's either a DK or a light worsted base, and I really enjoyed knitting it. It was the first time I'd used colourwork, it was the first time I was carrying yarns together, and I tried from the outset to knit two-handed colourwork because I knew that was going to be faster for me than picking up and dropping the yarns as I go. It was definitely a learning curve as projects go. My tension was quite wonky, shall we say, but I think hat projects are a really good starting point for learning colourwork for the first time, particularly hat projects that are sort of a worsted weight, maybe even an Aran, something that's going to go fairly quickly that you're going to be able to see the reward in. Because what I will say with learning this technique, and indeed any techniques, what works for me is to find a thing that I really want. Because as someone who has been knitting for a while now and is fairly competent, albeit still has the occasional dunder, as we've talked around, I do think there's something about motivating yourself to carry on learning by having a finished object that you really want. And for me personally, when I have to learn new techniques, knowing that I want the project and therefore will persevere with it is what stops it from becoming one of the number of whips that I have lurking in the background there. And so yeah, I would really recommend that. There's an awful lot of colourwork hat projects out there, but also if you are perhaps an adept sock knitter, maybe consider something like mittens. So again, there's a huge number of mitten projects out there. I know that Skein has her mitten club, so Ellie, who is Skein Knits on Instagram and has designs under Skein Knits on Ravelry as well. She has the Skein podcast. She has a mitten club which is designed to take you from kind of very early stages of both colourwork and mitten knitting generally, all the way through to knitting mittens at an incredibly sort of dense and more traditionally Scandinavian gauge, so those incredibly tight mittens that are super warm. So yeah, that might be something to consider as well. My lovely friend Julia, who is Julia J. Sanchez over on Instagram, asked me, do I have any favourite items in this glorious stash of mine? And the answer to that is absolutely I do, but it's kind of a difficult one for me because there's so much in here that I absolutely love. To choose favourites can be very difficult. For me, favourites are things that are genuinely irreplaceable. And I mean that in the sense of perhaps yarn that has been gifted to me, and therefore it's not just the yarn itself, but actually what it represents, that is something that's incredibly special. Or perhaps it's something that I'm not actually able to get anymore, perhaps because the dyer is no longer dyeing, or in at least one instance, sadly, is someone who's passed away. And so those things to me are probably the most precious. Everything else that's here, I have a notion that I can either replace it or find a very close replacement to it, but really it's those things that are so incredibly special that can't be replaced that are the things that mean the most to me. And in terms of examples of those, let me just pull a few skeins out of the stash and show you those just now. So I jumped into my stash, figuratively, and have pulled out a few skeins that have some special meaning to me, and so I thought I would show a couple of those to you just now. The first of those is from a dyer who is sadly no longer dyeing, and this is someone who, for those who've been around on Instagram for a little while and followed some hand dyers over there, for those who followed some podcasts in recent years, even if Instagram is not necessarily your bag, you may well have heard told of a dyer called Drusy Rising, and she was the most phenomenal dyer whose demands, whose updates were in such demand that I think really she was one of the people who really struggled with this notion of being so hugely in demand so quickly after she started her business. It was very much something that was both sort of based around the fact that she enjoyed dyeing, she wanted to share her yarns with the world, but between people recognizing her for being so kind of unique and so excellent at what she did, but still only being one person who was dyeing and doing it because she loved it, I can wholeheartedly understand the pressure that came with that was something that I think really weighed on her for quite a while. Now, I'm someone who, I don't know her, I've never spoken to her directly, but I can understand that it would be quite a challenging environment in which to continue to dye and to operate. So while it's a massive shame that she's no longer dyeing, I think I really do appreciate the decision that she came to with that. But I was lucky enough to grab one of her skeins while she was still dyeing, and so it's still in its wrapping, which is a little bit ridiculous. It's one of the few skeins I have in my stash that is still within its wrapping, because this is the original wrapping that it came in. So apologies for the crinkling, complete with its tag. But this is her solid twist sock, which is an 80/20 merino nylon. And this is in the, I believe this is the poolside colourway, which is the most beautiful. It's a blue, so you're going to get reflections off the lights there. It's a blue with speckles, with some gorgeous pinks and greens, and it's just stunning. And everything about her yarn was just absolutely delightful, from the bases that she chose to the branding that she had, the way that she packaged it. It really, really was a masterclass in hand dyeing. And as I say, very sad that she's no longer around. Absolutely appreciate and understand her decision, but also delighted to have this skein in my stash. Another skein that is incredibly special to me for not too dissimilar reasons, but slightly different, I guess, is this skein here of the Cyborg's Craft Room. Again, it is sock yarn. It is 75% superwash merino wool, 20% nylon, 5% stellina. It is her a sparklet base in the colourway Stellar, which is this incredible sort of galaxy nebula, blacks and purples and blues, and it's just beautiful. And there is some sparkle in there too, which I'm hoping you can see. The Cyborg's Craft Room, really, really unfortunately, the dyer behind this actually passed away, I think either last year or the year before. And so again, she is someone who I had bought some skeins from in the past, predominantly through, I believe it was her Etsy shop, maybe her own website, US based, and again a dyer who was incredibly talented with some truly beautiful colorways. And for that reason, as well as the fact that obviously this is now some very precious stash and cannot be replaced, this is definitely a very, very special skein in my stash, because it's absolutely stunningly beautiful. She was such a brilliant dyer, and yeah, I'm really, really sorry that she and her talents and amazing personality are no longer with us. So yeah, very special. Next up is a skein from a dyer and a fellow podcaster who I'm delighted to call a friend of mine. This is actually a skein from one of, if not her very first updates. And for that reason, for all that she still continues to dye and still has, I believe, this colourway and many, many more besides, just the fact that this was something from way back when she was first starting out, it makes it so precious to me. And so this is a skein of stress knits with her original branding in her rattle colourway, which was one of her first colours. She continues to dye some incredibly beautiful skeins to this day, but this is again back when she had a high twist base. This was her supple base, which was an 80/10/10 merino nylon cashmere in the rattle colourway. I don't believe the high twist base is a base that she still carries, but yeah, this is Stacey's yarn is astonishing. There's an awful lot in this little cubby hole up at the top here, including this card that comes from her, and I'm so pleased not only to have some of her yarn in my possession, but to call her a good friend of mine. And so to have something that reminds me of when she was just starting out, being able to support her way back when, it just, again, it makes me really happy. So this is a very, very precious skein of mine as well. And then last but not least, on a similar vein, we have another good friend of mine who is also just the most terrific dyer. I mentioned in episode 2, when I was talking about going up to people, walking up to people at festivals, introducing yourself, having a conversation, that in spite of the fact that I'm fairly kind of okay with conversations with strangers and having, you know, kind of engaging with people socially, that I did get quite awestruck when it came to walking up to and introducing myself to someone at a yarn festival. I was thinking of a specific instance with that, and that was Krishna of Villainville. And Krishna of Villainville is someone whose podcast I have been watching and indeed listening to way back when for years. And so to find someone who, you know, I've seen the projects that she's made, I've been very familiar with, you know, when she started her yarn business, all the way through to the kind of wild success that she's experiencing with it now, and the rebrand that she and her podcast have just been through. And so to actually swallow all of that and go over to someone and say, hi, I've been watching you for a really long time. Thank you so much for the time and effort and energy that you put into these podcasts and sharing them and your amazing dyes with the world. It did make me feel a bit awkward, but I'm so glad that I did, because Kristen, true to form, was wonderfully polite, incredibly sweet, And I did give her a card with just a note that said thank you so much for the kind of work that she'd done, in the hope that I'd seen her. I always took that card along with me, and she was so kind and sent me a small gift back not small gift really at all, but by way of thank you, and so gave me one of her very first skeins that she dyed up in the Edinburgh colourway. And so, because this is my hometown, Edinburgh, because this is a skein of yarn that I was gifted from someone who I now consider to be a great friend, and because frankly just the colourway is beautiful and it sums up her thoughts and her time that she spent at the Edinburgh Yarn Festival, where we finally met, this again is incredibly special to me. And I don't want you to think for a second that I'm just choosing kind of prominent podcasters and kind of all making it cliquey and all those sorts of things. That's really not the case at all. It is just that these two people who have who are podcasters, who are, I'm delighted to say, good friends of mine. I am delighted to have yarn from them in my stash. Both of these skeins mean an awful lot to me. I have lots of their yarn besides, but these two skeins in particular mean a lot to me. In Stacey's case, because it was such an early update of hers back when she had her original branding and was just starting out, and in Kristen's case, because this is a skein that it's really the first skein that we or that I have since we had a chance to meet, and was kind of a gift off the back of that. So it's incredibly special to me in that respect as well. And can we just talk about how pretty these three look together? I mean, I don't know that I could ever use them in a project together. I'm not sure that I could use any of them in a project at all, because they're that kind of special. But I don't know, these two in particular, they're just so pretty. People are so talented. Missy Pants over on Ravelry, excellent name by the way, asks, do I have any other hobbies aside from knitting, and what podcasts do I listen to? And really, really good questions. Hobbies other than knitting, honestly, knitting is first and foremost my sole obsession outside of working. And I have in previous years, I've done quite a lot of singing. I used to sing in an a cappella group, and before you go too far down the, it's like Glee, we weren't really your sort of Glee kind of a cappella or sort of Pitch Perfect type. If anything, if you thought of the Pitch Perfect films and thought more of like your sort of German techno dust sound machine sort of thing, more somewhere in between them and like Troublemakers, it was a little bit kind of hip and kind of quite indie style music. I definitely wasn't cool enough to be in it, let's put it that way, right from the get-go. But we did quite a lot of music by the Foo Fighters and by MGMT, and it was a really cool group to be part of. But between moving to a different town, so I moved out of London for a little bit, and just with work taking hold, I struggled to be able to sort of continue meeting in the rehearsals. But I did really enjoy it. It's definitely something I consider going back to. I've also, again, way back in my past, done a bit of theatre. I touched on that last week when I was talking around my time in Berlin. But in recent years, I'd say it's been knitting first and foremost. I do have a hankering to get more into photography, particularly having seen some of the amazing work that Kristen has been doing recently. I'm conscious my FO pictures leave a lot to be desired, and therefore they could definitely do with some work. But for the most part, I think knitting is probably my primary obsession. And given I do have quite an intensive sort of time spent working, I need to kind of pare it down to just one really, really big obsession. In terms of podcasts, I think you could probably nip into my YouTube subscription channels and see some of the knitting related podcasts that are over there that I tend to watch a lot of. But in terms of podcasts outside of knitting related ones, I do want to give one particular shout out. And if you follow me on Instagram, apologies because I've probably bored you senseless about this already, but if you are a fan, as I hope you are, of female hosted, quite sweary, with a lot of asides and a little bit of humour sprinkled in over the top, but still hopefully learning something, I feel like this is going to be right up your street. There is a tremendous podcast that I have followed since it started just over a year ago now, called Ologies. Ologies is an audio podcast. It can be downloaded from wherever you download your audio podcasts, and it is hosted by the hilarious Ali Ward. Ali is someone who has been in the podcasting world for quite a long time now. She used to host a podcast called Slumber Party with Georgia Hardstark, who, as My Favourite Murder fans will know, is half of the My Favourite Murder podcast. Ali Ward and Georgia Hardstark previously had worked together on a few different things, including some TV programmes and, as I mentioned, the Slumber Party podcast, which was excellent, but have since gone on to pursue their own sort of passion-related projects. And Ali's passion in particular is around science and learning, and basically bringing a really hilarious viewpoint to some ologies, which in this case are sciences or things that scientists and various different individuals have studied, and uses her humour to bring those to life in a way that is surprisingly engaging and consistently hilarious. And so, as I say, if you are a fan of wanting to listen to podcasts that help you to learn a little bit, I really enjoy podcasts that are entertaining, but also I feel as though I'm using my time valuably. I have gone through phases with podcasts over the years, some in particular that I really enjoyed listening to, but I just got a little bit, I think, worn down by, in the sense of there were a lot of true crime podcasts that I listened to, and I had a bit of a true crime burnout, I think, at one point. And so to go to something like Ologies, where I feel as though I'm constantly learning something, but all the while having a really, really good laugh, I really, really would recommend it. It's great, and there's so many fantastic guests on there, so many of whom are just fucking badass women. It is brilliant. If you're looking for a few specific episodes to start from, can I please recommend way back, episode number 1, Volcanology, which is the science of volcanoes. There was a fantastic episode around dendrology, which is trees, with Casey Klatt. And then just immediately after that, I think there was a 2-parter episode on fearology, and that is with Dr. Mary Poffenroth. And that 2-parter is genuinely life-changing. I'm just going to leave it there. Just go and listen to it, lend it your ears, and you will not be sorry, I promise. My dear and wonderful friend Claire, who is Transient Meow over on Ravelry, who is someone that I am super excited to have already met by the time this podcast goes live, she asked me a few different questions, the first of which is, do my mum and my grandmother still knit? Really good question. Unfortunately, my grandmother is no longer with us. She passed away just before I turned 18. She had a very good innings, do not get me wrong. She was born in 1912, and so by now would be, very, very advanced in her years. She actually, for all that she taught me to knit, or at least attempted to teach me to knit with my mum, I'm not convinced she was much of a knitter herself. I certainly don't remember her doing much knitting when I was growing up. My mum, however, my mum had knit quite a lot before I was born, and had quite a lot of yarn and things that she'd knit, but hadn't really done much at all since I was born. I can't think why, a certain individual person running around screaming a lot of the time would have, taken away her love of doing things with stabby needles. But hey, who can say? But certainly in recent years, particularly the more that I've got into knitting, my mum has come back to it a little bit. I don't think she's anything like as obsessed as I am, which again, I'm just going to mention the elephant in the room here. She has got a fair bit of yarn, but I know that she is, I would say, still probably quite fond of knitting things flat. I think the notion of knitting in the round, correct me if I'm wrong, Mum, is still something that daunts you a little bit, although we are working on that. We're looking to get a few more patterns and things under your belt, and that wasn't meant to sound quite so patronising. I do apologise, Mum. But yeah, she's certainly interested in knitting, albeit thinks I probably have a big enough stash as it is, which, is rude. Claire also asks, what's been my biggest disappointment? And I'm guessing you want me to talk in knitting terms, because otherwise I'd need to do a bit more thinking about that, to be honest. But in terms of knitting disappointment, that is a really good question. I think I'm going to go with my worsted Boxey. Now, my worsted Boxey, there's not a huge amount of photographic evidence of this. I'm not even sure there's a project page for it, and there's good reason for that. I really wanted to convince myself that I could get away with wearing light mint green. And I think it's fair to say that that wasn't an entirely successful venture. So I knit a worsted boxy using Malabriga Rios in the water green colourway, and it is a gorgeous colourway, and in fact if you give me a second I will dig some out. So here we have Malabriga Rios in water green, and it just doesn't work on me. I really want it to, but the camera's actually making it slightly more vibrant than I think it is in person, and it just washes me out massively. Also, the worsted boxy, again, a pattern that looks good pretty much universally, except on me. There was just something about it. I think my arms were knit a little bit too tight. The general sort of look on it, again, because it is worsted weight, it doesn't drape quite so well as the fingering weight boxies I think probably do. So again, that might be an option for me to look at in the future. But just the combination of it really didn't work. And I so wanted it to, because look at how pretty this colour is. I just, yeah, didn't work. Kind of sucks. Claire also wants to know, what's my favourite dessert? And that is an excellent question, Claire. Do I have a favourite dessert? Crumbs. I am a very, very big fan of anything that's got salted caramel in it. And so there is a Haagen-Dazs salted caramel ice cream, which is to die for. If you have not tried it, and if you are a fan of that sort of nature of things, just put me on pause. I will wait. Go out and find yourself some right now and put it in your face hole, because my word, it is delicious. So on sort of in that vein, essentially anything that's kind of caramelly I do quite like. So banoffee pie as a notion, always a winner in my book. I do really enjoy meringues, and so anything with kind of meringue there, not the kind of like lemon meringue pie style meringue where it's kind of all still very, very gooey, but rather the baked meringues that are slightly crisp on the outside, maybe with a little bit of goo in the middle. Oh, they're very good. I mean, you can't really go wrong with brownies and chocolate cake. I mean, have I covered all the food groups yet in terms of chocolate, sugar, ice cream? I mean, can you tell I've got a bit of a sweet tooth? Another great friend of mine who is Bookcase Hat on Ravelry, who is Emily, and again I'm so looking forward to get to meet in real life. She had a couple of questions for me too, the first of which was, what is your most worn hand knit? And this is a brilliant question. I think I didn't necessarily intend it to become my most worn hand knit, but it is probably the most sort of functional and adaptable item that I have ever knit, and that is my campsite shawl, which I will put a picture up here of. And bear in mind, my FO pictures are not particularly stellar, but yeah, there you go. Campsite shawl is by Alicia Plummer. It is a fairly simple and straightforward eyelet shawl. It's knit in DK weight. I think I knit it in Northbound Knitting Merino Silk DK in a gorgeous grey kind of pewter colourway. And I think the fact that it's in grey and that it's a massive cosy shawl with a really nice bit of drape to it that wears really well just makes it indispensable. And so if there are days when it's a little bit cold, I'll chuck it on over the top of a sweater. I've worn it with coats, I've worn it in the depths of winter. It's so ridiculously versatile. And as someone who is not much of a shawl knitter, I really need to knit more bloody shawls because this one is getting so much wear. I do also have, and I know you can't really see it, but on the back of the door here is a Lemmy K shawl. That is a pattern by, I want to say Isabel Kramer, I might be wrong. Again, I'll put it up on the side here so you can see it, but that's a gorgeous, again, it's a DK weight shawl. It takes just under 3 skeins of yarn. It is predominantly stockinette with a little bit of lace and cables around the bottom along with the deep rib, and that again is incredibly versatile. It's in Madeline Tosh DK Twist, of course it is, in the Fog colourway, which again is this beautiful sort of mottled deep sea green colour with a little bit of a grey wash over the top of it, which is really pretty. Also very versatile, not quite as versatile as grey. And so what I think I need to do is just suck it up and knit more grey shawls, because it's what I want to wear. She also asks, what is the sweater that I've been vicariously knitting for the longest? And this is such an excellent question. I have a number of sweaters that I have been mentally knitting for a really long time. I have yarn for them. In some instances I've cast them on and then ripped it out again because I just wasn't in the right headspace at the time. And again, kind of going back to my desert island knitting question and the patterns and designers that I'd be choosing for there, funnily enough, Michelle Wong features heavily, Nora Gaughan features heavily, and Thea Coleman features heavily as well. And so I don't think I can narrow it down to just one. I would certainly call out the Stonecutter, which is a Michelle Wong pattern that I think, almost everyone will have seen at some point or another. I did cast this on, I knit it for a little bit, I didn't love how it was turning out in the yarn that I'd chosen, and so I ripped it out again. The same thing can be said for my Ondawa sweater, also a Michelle Wong pattern, where I cast it on, I knit it for a bit, I didn't love how it was turning out, and I took it out again. And both of them, I still really, really want the finished sweaters. I'm going to skip on to your next question because I feel like this helps me address and answer this. So the last question she asked me was, do I consider myself more of a process or a project knitter? So in other words, am I someone that's really excited about the end project and that's what keeps me going and motivated throughout? Or am I really excited about knitting it as I go? And so for me, what I would say in both of those instances is both of those things, I really, really want the finished project. But in going through the process, in actually knitting them, I wasn't loving it enough to persevere. And that's kind of me. That explains the whip situation that I have, as well as just where I'm at in terms of the things that I knit, the things that I enjoy. There are an awful lot of things out there, hence Knitting Vicariously as a podcast, that I desperately want to knit. I just also know that there are certain things that I have to be in the right frame of mind for, and sometimes that frame of mind is harder to achieve than others. And so for me, I think I'm a bit of a hybrid of both. I really enjoy finding projects that I want. They are incredibly powerful and give me a huge amount of motivation to get them done. However, they also need to be the right thing to do at that point in time, so I need to enjoy the process. And so ultimately, while I think I'm driven to want to knit things from a project point of view, if I'm not enjoying them enough from a process perspective, that can sometimes overrule it. So in answer to your question, both. Ooh, and my favourite cocktail? Porn star martini. It's not very classy. It's really good though. Mickey Thompson over on Instagram asked me what were the favourite projects that I'd had that I'd made and that I'd been gifted. And that's a really, really great question. In terms of my absolute favourite project that I've ever made, I think it would have to be my Beatnik sweater. Beatnik is a pattern by Nora Gaughan. It was featured in Knitty magazine a number of years ago. It is a free pattern and it is just the most incredible free pattern. If you haven't already knit or considered knitting a Beatnik sweater, I highly, highly recommend you look into it. In terms of why it's my favourite project, aside from the fact that it is in yellow, and I will put a picture of me wearing it right here, you can see how happy it makes me. It's a glorious, glorious project, but aside from the fact, as I mentioned, I knit it in yellow, I knit it in Madeline Tosh, I think it was 80-10-10 worsted in the Lannister Gold colourway, which I have some remnants of over here, gold. It was also the first time that I tried to convert a project that was the pattern was written to be knit flat, and so I converted it to be knit in the round. And because I went through quite a lot of thinking and mental processing, because I put it to one side for quite a long time and didn't come back to it, I very much kind of needed to walk away from it and to the point around process or project knitting, have a think about whether this was something I definitely wanted, and I decided that I did. I came back to it, I persevered, so I knit it in the round up until the armholes. I knit the front and the back, did a 3-needle bind off to join the two together, and then picked up for the sleeves and knit short rows for the shaping all the way down. Given it was the first time I had done any of those things in modifying a pattern, by that point I'd done a few patterns, or I'd knit a few jumpers that had followed that pattern, and so I was confident in doing it, but this was the first time I'd adapted something specifically for that purpose. And the fact that I just really bloody love the finished object, that's probably my favourite knit to date, because it felt quite challenging. So yeah, absolutely adore my Beatnik, and that is, I think, probably my favourite thing I've ever knit. In terms of favourite that I have been gifted, I mean, That's such a good question. I've been lucky enough to be gifted a number of different things over the years. Some from my mum, which I love dearly. Others from knitters who I've met either in real life or being part of swap groups. I think my absolute favourite is probably a hat that I was given as part of a swap many years ago. So it was a fantastic swap that I did in a group that I was part of previously on Ravelry, and I had been partnered up with someone who actually I had swapped something with previously. So I'd sent a swap to her in previous months, and then she'd received me as a partner. She then sent me the most beautiful hat that she had knit in, again, Madeline Tosh, it's becoming such a feature, in the leaf colourway. And leaf was a colourway that at the time was discontinued. I think it's since made a little bit of a comeback potentially, but it's the most beautiful, vibrant lime green. It's not a colour that I would have picked for myself. It's not a pattern that I would knit for myself. And that's what made it brilliant. And I think there is something about knitters where people are kind of tempted to look at things that we have in our queues, maybe want to knit vicariously, and to gift us those things. And certainly for me personally, I kind of don't want that, because as I touched on, I'm not really sure if I'm a process knitter or a project knitter, but if I want the thing, I kind of want to knit the thing. Whereas if you knit me something that I have never seen or never even contemplated knitting, or perhaps, don't take this the wrong way, but maybe sometimes something that I wouldn't want to knit because it's quite just straightforward, and maybe I'm in a sort of frame of mind where I want to knit something that's super challenging, but it's something that's going to be really, really usable. I love that. Thank you so much for that. So I have now this gorgeous bright green hat that I never would have considered knitting for myself, but I love. And so yeah, that's probably for me one of my absolute favourite things that I've been gifted. Yeah. Juniper Grace over on Instagram also asked, which knitters, designers or dyers would you take to the pub and why? And in all honesty, my first response to this question was, well, how big is the pub? I love the idea of going out for a drink with as many of you as possible, and whether you're designers, whether you're dyers, whether you knit a little bit, where you knit almost entirely vicariously, whether you are on Instagram or on Ravelry or on neither, I love just getting to meet and chat with knitters, and particularly those of you who have joined me here on the podcast, who have commented and taken the time to say hello and so on and so forth. You all sound like excellent people, even if your taste in podcasts is somewhat questionable, and I would just love to spend time and have a chat with you. And I hope that doesn't come across as a really trite answer, because I don't mean it to at all. I have some really nice pubs near me in London, so if you are going to be around here, let me know and we will put this into practice. But yeah, that's going to be my answer really. So yeah, as many of you as I can fit. And I think that's it. I think I've got through all of your questions, and despite, having zero knitting content, this has been a bit of a mammoth episode. So thank you so much for all your time, for your questions, for those of you who reached out and posed some questions for me across YouTube, Instagram and Ravelry. I really do appreciate it. And thank you too to those of you who have sat through all of this, hopefully with the aim of finding out a little bit more about me, perhaps just passing the time, but ultimately hopefully not being too disappointed by the complete lack of knitting content in this episode. I promise you wholeheartedly that when I return from the US, hopefully this time next week, depending on the jet lag, that I will have a bit of a bumper episode to share with you. So for the time being, I would love to see you over on Ravelry, on the Knitting Instagram account or on the hashtag. Come and say hi. I'd love to see what you're up to. But in the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic rest of day, rest of week. I hope your knitting is keeping you happy and fulfilled, and if it's not, that you're enjoying some time spent knitting vicariously. And until next time, keep on keeping on. Bye. And so this little indentation here, which is going to be interrupted by a plane, which is just fucking rude. With the planes, could you not? Heathrow, I know you're like 5 miles away, but could you just... Ugh. Why don't you like me? Why can't we be friends? Ow. That really hurt. Ow. Susan!